So welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the TCM community. And today we're joined by Dr. James Flowers. Dr. Flowers is a Brain Pool Program Research Fellow at Kyung University of Korean Medicine in South Korea. And he is a historian of medicine in East Asia. And he focuses mostly on Korea. He's also a Chinese medicine practitioner. He has a PhD in history of medicine from Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Welcome, Dr. Flowers, to the TCM community.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm really happy to be here.
I'm happy you joined us. We'd like to thank you again for taking your time to join us today.
No problem.
I'd like to focus on a topic that isn't normally touched on very often, and especially for those of us studying traditional Chinese medicine, and that is something you're specialized in is traditional Korean medicine, and they refer to it as KM, right? Korean medicine.
Yeah, we can say KM.
We can say KM. Okay. First of all, for the general audience, what is the difference, in your opinion? What are the most striking differences between traditional Chinese medicine and Korean medicine?
Yeah. I guess you would ask that question. It's a fair question, but it's difficult to answer. It can get you into lots of trouble. But I would say, starting right off, the main difference is due to social and political reasons, and factors, social political factors, and I would say, mainly because of the administrative setup in Korea, which means that Korean medicine is not really strictly supervised by the state. And what that means is that instead of saying Korean medicine or KM, I would say Korean medicines, plural. And what I mean is that it's really diverse and there are multiple different styles. And so to say that there is one style of Korean medicine just doesn't work. First, it's diverse, it's multiple, and there are many styles. Why that is because if we compare it to the medicines that's practiced in China and Japan, so in China and Japan, the state or the government is very keen on standardization, on producing textbooks that more or less have the same style of medicine. And I think all of those who are practicing, we're familiar with the TCM style, and we're familiar with TCM style acupuncture. And so what happens in Korea is that people study, they do the university course, and the university training is more or less pretty similar to what people would study in China. The differences are not that great, right? It's pretty much the same. So the old standards, you learn about yin yang, go through the theory, qi, etc., and you learn about Shahan Lun, and you learn Huang Yi Neijing, and then you learn all the acupuncture styles. But here's the difference with China, which makes the Korean medicine styles similar to what happens globally outside of China, is that people then go off and practice a whole range of their own styles. Just from my own observation, and this is not something that Koreans themselves say, my own observation is that there is more emphasis on tonifying, or in Chinese you say bo, more emphasis on tonifying and strengthening. And then in addition to the more emphasis on tonifying, there is an emphasis more on the heart or the spirit, or the shen we say shen in Chinese, or the spirit. And so even though there are multiple styles, I think most of the styles concentrate on the emotions or the spirit. And how does that work? It means that when people do their university course, right? They do the university course and they do the 6 years and they graduate, and they go off and they open their own clinics, very much the same as, say, in Western countries, like in Europe.
Mhm.
So people are free to have their own style. So no one will really care what style they do. So what people do is they join associations or lineages. So they prefer the word lineages. So there are multiple lineages, and probably there are 3 major lineages, and people will actually join up and they become a member, and there'll be a master. So it's not exactly the apprenticeship system, but it is a system of there's a master, and then you attend meetings and workshops and seminars, or you have training.
But that's interesting because I thought there would be more, not interference, but more regulation from the government in Korea because, for example, the education is well regulated, 6 years. I mean, TCM or traditional medicine practitioners enjoy a high status in Korea, and also they have a decent salary. So I thought there was going to be more regulation involved from the government.
So you're right. Yeah. So you hit on
But
some good points that I didn't mention. But I'd like to, maybe I'll talk about COVID to illustrate what I mean.
all
So
right.
COVID will serve the purposes of explaining. So you're right. So I'd like to reiterate your points that you just made, that there is a very strict education system through universities. There are 11 universities, you're right. And it's very, very difficult to get in. Only the top 1% of high school students get in. And you're right, the KM doctors have high status, probably equivalent to biomedicine, Western medicine doctors. And I'm being a bit flippant now, but most they drive around in Mercedes Benz and live in really posh areas. Yeah. So, okay, having said that, there is regulation in the sense that because of the National Health Service. So the National Health Service means that not most, all Koreans can claim back from the government the treatment, right? Especially acupuncture. So the patient will just pay a small amount. So that means that the government regulates, and what do they regulate in terms of safety and efficacy, not efficacy, but safety mainly. So as long as you're practicing within the realm of safety and you're not harming patients and no complaints. But then as for the style, the government doesn't care, right? But so let me talk about COVID. So we know that COVID first hit China in Wuhan, right, in 2020, early 2020. So Korea was the second country to get hit in February 2020. So Korea went through a really severe crisis because no one knew what was going on, similar to Wuhan, right? And the government, you're right, they tried to regulate, and they tried to say, so this is a really big difference to China. In China, the government more or less, they recruited Chinese medicine doctors and they recruited Chinese medicine. Okay. In Korea, they didn't. You're right. The government said, no, COVID is too serious. This must be a biomedicine thing, and Korean medicine, KM, stay out of this. So what happened was that the population was a little bit angry, and then the KM doctors got angry, and the KM doctors lobbied and wrote emails, wrote letters, and then went to visit the government offices and insisted that the KM doctors be allowed to treat COVID patients. And the government didn't know what to do, so they thought about it for 2 or 3 weeks, and finally they agreed that KM doctors could treat COVID patients, but only through telephone. And that was weird. So they thought that, if they actually see patients, that would cause increased transmission from infectious, so they said telephone. So, okay, telephone was 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, then they said, okay, TV screen or computer screen. And so for the whole of 2020, KM doctors could see COVID patients, but only through computer screen. But then here we come to the difference with China. with Chinese medicine in China. So in China, we know that there were some standardized formulas based on, for example, Lianhua Qingwen or Qingfei Paidotang or something like this. In Korea, I actually wrote an article. I did a lot of research on how KM doctors treated COVID. So they went a really different way. So there's no standardized formula. There's no actual formula. So that each case was treated on its own terms. Very, very similar to how you would treat, say, in Holland, or that's how you treat, right? You're not going to just use a standardized formula. So they just did that. So I would say that's the difference. And then I looked at what kind of herbs they were giving. It was mostly tonifying herbs, right? So again, it's very, very few ideas coming from Wenbing. So this is where I want to stress the difference with China. The Wenbing idea didn't get to Korea. So Koreans know about that. They're aware of that, but they very, very rarely use Wenbing ideas. So what main ideas do Koreans like is mostly Shahanlun. So here is where Korea is more similar to Japan. So in Japan, we know that Kampo is mostly Shahanlun. So Korea also is a lot of Shahanlun. So that's what happened. And then when Delta came, the Korean government got really worried and a bit panicked, and they tried to stop KM doctors again. So in 2021, it was not a good year for KM. So that's really, again, really different to China. So KM doctors were kind of complaining and trying to be diplomatic and saying, okay, we're going to wait this out. So this year, 2022, in the last month, because of the Omicron wave, Korea has had huge numbers of cases, huge numbers. So the government just gave up. They've given up. So it's just living with COVID, right?
Yeah.
And because of COVID, that means that most patients just go to see KM doctors now. And so looking at that, most KM doctors, they're giving so their analysis is 80% is cold. So they're prescribing warming herbs. So stuff like guizhitang and even giving ginseng, and some patients even giving fuzi, aconite. And so again, this is a really different approach to what's happening in China. And so on the one hand, the government tries to regulate, but I would say definitely the reason that they can't really control is because KM is so popular in Korea. So if you come to Korea, you would see that maybe 80%, 90% of people just think of KM as really part of their lives. And so we know that in China, there is some people who still complain, and some young people, they said, oh, I don't really believe Chinese medicine, and that's kind of old stuff. But that's not really a thing in Korea. In Korea, it's overwhelmingly popular. So for any government to move against KM or regulate KM too tightly, that would be really bad for because they need to go to the election. And so so to get re-elected it's a good move to say you support KM. So when elections come, most politicians will say, yeah, KM's good.
Maybe that's why I also found information that Korea has the highest percentage of traditional medicine doctors in hospitals and education, even compared to China.
Yeah, much more. So, for example, where there's shops, every street where there's shops, you will see a clinic of Korean medicine, and very prominent, and every shopping mall. So Korea is very funny. You'd have a shopping mall selling Hermes bags and high-end retail, and then you have a Korean medicine clinic in the next, among those shops, and you would smell the cooking, the herbs.
I was also wondering, is it more? I get the feeling that Korean medicine is more based percentage-wise, more herbal medicine than acupuncture, or is that different?
I don't think so. So I think it's really both. And the reason is that, so when people train, the training is both acupuncture and herbal medicine. But the reason why it's both is because people can claim the acupuncture on the medical, on the health insurance, national insurance.
Is
And
it
so when
only the, is it, oh, sorry, is it only the acupuncture that can be claimed by medical insurance?
you can claim something on the herbal medicines, but you still have to, the patient will have to still pay out something for the herbal medicines. I'm not really sure how much, but they'll have to pay half. But the acupuncture is more or less free. So if a patient went, and they didn't get acupuncture, it's kind of like, oh, they're losing out. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
the
yeah.
reason why. So,
Yeah.
but you're right. Most people, when they think of Korean medicine, they think of herbal medicine. So people think of herbal medicine. Why? Because it's more visible, because every street market, they're selling all the bunches of herbs, and it's part of the culture, right? So anyone can just buy the herbs, and then just enjoy a herbal drink. And people do that in their daily life, and they cook up some herbs with their soup and so on. But acupuncture should be only administered by professionals. So acupuncture is popular. Yeah, it's very popular.
By the way, the telemedicine during the COVID period, I take it because it was telemedicine, they were prescribing mainly herbal medicine to the patients,
Yeah,
right?
it must. Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have any information about the demographics? Was it mostly older people or
No, it was
different, all
it was
ages?
people of all ages, all ages. Yeah,
Okay.
I looked into that, and it was so in 2020, which was the initial outbreak, 20% of patients recovered due to the herbal medicine received through the telemedicine, because the government tried to control everything, but they couldn't. And so you probably know Korea, they were pretty confident and pretty proud in the first year. and so a lot of that was to do with the traditional medicine. But
Okay.
the global media, they never mentioned that. They always talk about other things, like, but they never mentioned the actual really important part of it. And actually now it's most people, they recover from Omicron, from the herbal medicine and acupuncture, because now the KM doctors can give acupuncture.
Right, right. I think we see the same trend all over the world. Well, I personally also see it here in my clinic in Holland.
Oh, you too? You got
Yeah,
COVID
yeah, yeah.
patients?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So, yes, of course, I tried to do some research online, and I found Hanyak and
Hanbang.
Hanbang. Yeah. Could you explain the difference to us?
Okay, so Hanyak, the first one you mentioned. So Hanyak, so yak means medicine. So it just means Korean herbal medicine. Hanbang is a different term which has totally different meaning. So Hanbang is the term that, so the Han in Hanbang is not Korea Han, it is the Han Dynasty Han, the Chinese Han Dynasty. So this Hanbang, it was a term that was used probably beginning in the 19th century, I'm not really sure, but it didn't become popular as a term until the 1930s. And it became popular as it was in the context of Japanese colonial rule. So when the Japanese ruled Korea from 1910 to 1945, but Hanbang, the idea came from the imperative that Korean doctors felt that they were trying to persuade the Japanese authorities that Korean medicine was good, and in the beginning of the Japanese rule, the Japanese rulers were saying that we're trying to build modernity, we're trying to be modern and scientific, and so what the Koreans argued is that, oh, we can make it scientific. So they borrowed a lot of the biomedicine, Western medicine terms, and also agreed that they would learn Western medicine, much the same as Chinese medicine doctors did, and much the same as Kampo medicine doctors did in Japan. And so they came up with this name Hanbang, which is exactly the same meaning as Kampo in Japanese. So Kampo is the Han Dynasty, and Po is the prescriptions. So it's Han Dynasty prescriptions. But then there's another double meaning, because the Han in Hanbang is the same name as the river that runs through Seoul. So the Han River, the Chinese character is the Han Dynasty River. And so the regional meaning of the Han character in Chinese is great or amazing, wonderful, something like this. And so the connotation is that Hanbang is kind of Korean, but also Chinese and also East Asian, because most Japanese, the reason why the Japanese use the word Kampo is because they were drawing from the Chinese Han Dynasty, because they're very interested in Shahanlun, and that's Kampo style. So that's why it's called Hanbang. So Hanbang became quite a popular term in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, even into the 60s and 70s. But gradually its name became less popular. Then as time went on, probably in the 2000s, in the 2010, it officially changed to the current name, which is Han, the Korean Han, which is the Hanyak that you were talking about.
Yeah.
So that is really Korea. So, but that only happened like 10 years ago. And before that, it was always the Chinese Han Dynasty Han that was the name referred to.
Yeah. Since you're a historian of Eastern traditional medicine in general, so what I'm hearing is the Kampo medicine and the traditional Korean medicine was based off the Han medicine. How did this development? I mean, was there already Kampo medicine in Japan, or did it go through Korea to Japan, or did it develop separately? Could you explain a little? Tell us more about that.
So here we go. So this is this is what I work on. So what I think and what I argue is that the thing is, now in the 21st century, we in our minds we think of Japan, Korea, and China as kind of separate political entities. So what I argue, what I say is that before the 20th century, Japanese doctors, Korean doctors, and Chinese doctors were in constant communication with each other. Maybe they couldn't meet each other much, but they would read each other's books and they would write letters to each other. So what I'm arguing is there is this commonality of East Asian medicine. And so a lot of the problems that occur now, why Korean medicine is not that popular is in the world, or especially in China, is because I think that the Chinese government thinks that Koreans have kind of separated themselves off, and that why aren't they in the family, or something like that. Is something like I know that the negative perception is that Koreans have kind of stolen Chinese medicine, right? But what I really believe is that there was no idea of separation before the 20th century. The only reason it got separated is because of political reasons. And so Korean, Japanese, Chinese, they all read many of the same texts, but so everyone would read Shahanlun, everyone read Huangli Neijing in Japan, China, and Korea. But Japanese would have their own doctors would write some texts, and Koreans wrote some texts. And so it means that there was some variation. So what I mean is that there's a lot of overlap, but also within that there's variation. So you can think of, say, in China, the northern style is different to southern style, or Sichuan style is different to Guangdong style. And then why that's not surprising. And so Koreans also have Korean styles, different styles. And to be honest, when people in Korea study, they call it KM, but they start off with the Chinese text, right? They start off with the same text, Huangli Neijing. But the thing is that this is really weird and hard to explain, but Koreans, they don't think of it as solely Chinese text. They think of it as a universal text, in the same way that I could give analogies, in the same way that people read the Bible. No one says, oh, this only belongs to Israel or Palestine or that belongs to everyone. So the Koreans and Japanese also, they think of the Huanine Jing, yeah, it's Chinese, totally, but it's also ours. And then I know that some Chinese get really sensitive. And I'm talking as a person who's half Chinese. So I'm half Chinese. So I'm not talking as a Korean, but I know that some Chinese get sensitive and they say, "Oh, you've taken our knowledge." But Koreans, they think we're already in the same family.
Yeah. That's right. We should view, even now, we shouldn't let traditional medicine be divided by geopolitical stuff.
Thank you. Exactly. That's what I mean. And that's why
we should see it as one of the a global universal human medicine, right?
Thank you. Yeah, exactly. That's the problem. So I might be getting off topic again, but that's one of the problems, that the biomedicine, they're identified, they are really one profession. So they produce their power because they are actually unified. And we are not unified. So even amongst Chinese doctors outside China, globally, there is no one body that brings everyone together. We can share many of the ideas, but there's no kind of social mechanism where we all identify as one family. So in Korea and Japan.
Sorry to interrupt. Speaking of this unification, I read something. I don't know if it's your quote or you quoting Harvard historian Charles Rosenberg, who did an analysis of the rise of the authority of Western doctors in the U.S. And something that really appealed to me is, I'm just going to read a little. So, asserting primacy in medicine also meant creating boundaries around healing therapies rooted in other cultures. So if 2020 and 21 have taught us anything, it is that the limitations of Western medicine reveal the possibilities of concomitant usefulness of other medical cultures. Breaking down unnecessary boundaries between East and West requires moving outside the conceptual comfort zones. Chinese medicine or Korean medicine doesn't have to be foreign, just as a Western scientific medicine belongs to us all. So do Chinese and Korean medicine. Like I said, this unity in Western medicine, and which we don't have in traditional medicine, it's mainly a political separation that's being made, right? So we should unify globally, and that's what I'm trying to do with this platform. Traditional medicine.
We don't need to be separated.
We don't need to be separated. And also, I never thought of it that way, but that's why you're the historian here, is that this region made use, this medicine came from this large East Asian region. So that's why they identify with it's our medicine. It's the same as, for example, when Europe was also, now we see it as Germany and Austria, but in Mozart, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's time, it was the Holy Roman Empire. It's a totally different region.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, I thank you for opening this, making me see this clearly.
Exactly. That's what I think. Yeah.
Yeah. One thing that comes to mind, though, is that that would mean that Koreans and Japanese in that time also read Chinese characters, but they also read Chinese. Of course. Yeah.
And still now.
Okay. So still now.
All Korean medicine doctors, of course, they write and read in Korean, but they all learn Chinese characters. And the classical characters.
Not the modernized.
Not the modernized.
Not the simplified. No. Yeah.
And they read, but they read in Korean pronunciation. So it's something like Japanese will read, but in Japanese pronunciation. But the meaning is the same.
Yeah.
Just to quickly explain to the listeners. So when I said that the Koreans, they read Chinese texts, but all Koreans will read this book by Ho-Jun, which is called The Treasured Mirror of Eastern Medicine. And that was produced in the 1600s. And so the author is Ho Jun, who was a physician, and the Korean name is Dongyi Bogam, and the Chinese name is Dongyi Baojian. So, and this is a kind of encyclopedia of East Asian medicine. So again, many of the ideas came from Chinese sources. So it kind of compiled many of the ideas, but because the authors preferred a particular style, so it starts off with the ideas of Sun Zimiao, right? Who was a Chinese doctor from the Tang period. So it starts off with Sun Zimiao, and it starts off with talking about Taoism as a very strong influence in Korea. And then also, it also draws a lot from Zhang Zhongjin, Sha Hanlun. So there's this kind of a combination of all these different styles. And then also the influence of Confucianism in medicine is still strong. And that's something that kind of got knocked out of most of Chinese medicine in China, at least in the 20th century. And because in Korea, there is more continuity, whereas in China went through these great ruptures and changes and change in society. So Korea didn't have that. So Koreans still always talk about Confucius. And this runs through the medicine. And so there's one particular style of medicine called Sasang medicine. So if I didn't mention that, many of the readers will think, why didn't this guy mention this really important style, which is Sasang, which means the 4 constitutions or 4 body types. And Sasang medicine was produced in the late 19th century by a doctor called Ijima. And so when you ask me what is the difference, I think maybe half of the doctors in Korea would use Sasang style in their practice. And probably in the university, they learn about it, but it's not emphasized. What's emphasized is more or less something quite similar to what TCM students will learn in China. But Korean doctors, when they go to a clinic, they like Sasang medicine. So just very, very quickly, they divide people into 4 body types. And this is strongly connected to emotional types. And then the idea is that the body is a spiritual body, so that when TCM doctors are all aware of this, but what I'm saying is that in this Sasang style, they emphasize this kind of emotional aspect a lot. And so that might be one difference with the kind of styles of TCM that people practice in China itself. But
and then they also categorize to these different body types of specific foods and categories, right? Oh, okay,
So categories like Taiyang, Shaoyang, Taiyin, Shaoyin, the 4 categories. So it's something similar to Sha Hanlun. It's more focused on emotions. So Sha Hanlun doesn't mention emotions, right? But Sha Hanlun is just the physical, or kind of the levels of disease, right? The 6 levels or whatever.
Anyway, really nice talking to you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's my pleasure. It was an honor to have you here on this program, and we hope to see you next time on the TCM community and talk some more about acupuncture and history, or traditional medicine and history.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Thanks, Dr. Flowers.
James. Call me James.
Okay, thanks. And see you next time.
Okay.